So today's words are loving kindness. Loving kindness. So usually in a story about spiritual teaching and grace, we expect the teacher to impart wisdom, right? We expect the teacher to know her way, to know his purpose, and to know the lesson. We expect an agenda resulting in learning. What if something challenges the teacher? Interrupts the agenda? I want to talk today about a story from the Gospel of Matthew, one that has specific and important meaning to me. As a Christianish, Taoist, Buddhist, paganist, Unitarian, Universalist, preacher, chaplain type person. So, as this story goes, Jesus was walking down the road in an unfamiliar land. He'd just finished healing some people and doing some stuff. The sun was beating down hot on the road. He and his disciples were walking. He just finished chewing out some scribes and elders for telling him that tradition was more important than following the call of God and performing acts of kindness and grace. He just finished trying to explain that it's what we say and do that matter to God, not if we follow the rules, not really. So I should probably pause here and define my term like I enjoy doing. Address that use of the G word, because I know some of us here have been beaten by folks using that word in the name of that word. And I know that a lot of people have done a lot of nasty things in the name of that word. So I kind of feel the need to say that my concept of God comes from my favorite Unitarian Universalist theologian, James Luther Adams. And he wrote it in his essay, A Faith for the Free, published in 1946. Now, some of you have heard this before from me, but I think it bears repeating. God is that reality which works upon us and through us, and in accord with which we can achieve truth, beauty, or goodness. It is that creativity which works in nature and history under certain conditions, creating human good in human community. So when I talk about God in this story, I'm talking about that transformational, creative, inspiring, loving, guiding spirit that calls us to our better selves. That intangible something that invites us to live in loving and kind relationship with all of creation. But that is a lot of words, so if you don't mind, I'd like to use the G word. So Jesus rebuked the scribes and elders for getting rules and goodness confused. And he was probably on his way to do some more healing and acts of kindness for the people of Israel. Now I want you to picture Jesus with his entourage walking down the road, full of spiritual authority, surrounded by devoted disciples, tough, hard workers, strong, fishermen, farmers. Picture that dirt road with a throng moving along it in the heat of day. People try to approach him, but his Israelite disciples around him check IDs and try to make sure that Jesus is safe, at least as best they can. These muscled, tough farmers, fishermen, and working folk. And around this entourage is a woman wailing, crying out for help. She's not like them, she's an outsider, the wrong color, the wrong gender. She's shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Her daughter is tormented by a demon. Her daughter. Anyone who has ever contemplated or experienced the suffering of a loved one, the torment of a child, well, her clothes probably smell of sickness, her fear, her daughter's illness, her hair ragged, and she wails for help. Her daughter is tormented by a demon. Anyone who encounters this figure, this pain, their heart ought to break at that statement. But what does Jesus do? He doesn't answer her at all. He keeps on walking down the dirt road, one sandal in front of the other, walking in thought. And what do his disciples do? Surrounding him in the heat of the day, feet crunching as they walk on the dirt road? Well, she runs alongside for a while, and the disciples tell Jesus, send her away. She keeps shouting at us. She keeps shouting after us. Shouting and wailing. So send her away. And Jesus calls out, maybe to his disciples, maybe to her, I was sent for the lost children of Israel. He is not for her. His grace, his authority, his healing power, he is meant for the people of Israel, the chosen people of God, the privileged. She runs ahead and catches up and kneels, begging for help. Her knees probably tear on the stones of the road as she skids to her knees by this walking man. But her daughter is tormented by a demon, suffering in sickness. Lord, help me, she begs, and throws herself down. She pleads. Jesus responds, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Not fair to take food from the children of Israel, the chosen ones, to feed the dogs, the outsiders. Jesus says it's not fair to waste his time and energy on the dogs. And I imagine she would feel like a dog kneeling in the dirt and begging. But in her fervor, her desperation, her humiliation, she doesn't back down. Even in the midst of the crowds, watched by these Israelites where she's an outsider, surrounded by strangers, looking up at this master of spiritual authority, and she challenges the master. She actually looks up and challenges the teacher. This man who has the courage to rebuke scribes, elders, and the establishment. This child of God who's demonstrated power to work miracles, who has fed thousands and walked on water. His presence, his charisma, his authority must have been almost unbearable. But for the sake of her daughter, she challenges him. She looks up and says, yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Even dogs eat the crumbs. She doesn't even argue with him that she's anything other than a dog. For the sake of her daughter, she just begs. Can you imagine the reaction of his disciples? The people around him? They would all be watching him to see what Jesus would do. Would he smite her like Moses? David? He's a son of David. He's a king. They would have all believed he had such power. Would have done it for it if he'd asked. Dragged her away, beat her at the side of the road. It is all over their sacred texts. God had commanded such things before. But Jesus, this teacher, the one who came to change all of that, he doesn't do any of that. He answers her, woman, how great is your faith? Let it be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed instantly. Her daughter's suffering ended. I love this story. It's a story of loving kindness, of beautiful loving kindness. It's a story of a teacher who was about his mission, his purpose, who had direction, followers, responsibility to his people, his tribes. It's a story of a teacher who stopped in the midst of all of that and changed direction, changed all the rules for the sake of compassion, for love's sake. It's a story of inspiration, a moment of that creative inspiration that invites us into loving kindness. I remember when I first came into clinical pastoral education. My first week, first orientation. I had no idea what I was doing at all. Father Lincoln Ure, the director of the program, said to us, just act from loving kindness. If you bring loving kindness, you will do okay. It was perhaps one of the most bizarre moments of professional training I had ever had in my life. I wanted rules to follow. I wanted guidelines. I wanted to know what to expect. What I quickly learned is that when I think I know what to expect, I'm like Jesus on that road, surrounded by my agenda, my own ideas, my own people. And I miss the woman's crying for help. I forget that loving kindness doesn't follow an agenda. So one of my worst moments as a chaplain was related to having an agenda with a patient. She was an older woman in the intensive care unit, and the staff was very worried about having to respond if she coded. The medical term code means when someone's heart stops. So the staff was worried about what they would do if her heart stopped. By law, unless they have advance directives from a patient or clear direction from a legal spokesperson, medical staff have to perform CPR and take extreme measures to try and restart a heart. She was in her late 80s. Her body was frail. Restarting her heart would probably break her ribs. Putting the breathing tube down her throat would probably cause irreparable damage. So I had a good agenda. Walking into her room was like walking down that road. With all the good company of my companions to spread the good word, to take care of her. I wanted to do advance directives with her. To follow the rules so that she would not have to go through more suffering. I tried several times to get her to talk about the advance directives. Something was bothering me. I was there for the Israelites, the advance directives. I brought the visit in for verbatim with my peers, for reflection with them. I had to. Something seemed wrong. I didn't get her to do the advance directives. She wouldn't talk about it. In verbatim, my peers noticed that she had been trying to tell me her life story. Wanted to talk about losing her husband, the death of one of her children. What it was like to live in an old body breaking down. She wanted to touch her happy memories and her sad memories, like the woman by the side of the road. She tried to interrupt my agenda, and to my shame, I didn't let her. Every time she tried to share her story, I brought her back to the advance directives, for her own sake. I am for the people of Israel. Looking at the visit with my peers was an incredible learning experience. I felt the heartbreak of what we call empathic failure. I recognized that I had failed to listen. There is a creative moment that calls us to listen, to leave our course, to let the woman suffering by the side of the road interrupt us, the patient in the hospital interrupt our agenda, so they can be heard. When we hear them, when we stop and express that loving kindness, then there can be healing. Woman, how great is your faith? Let it be done for you as you wish. So today is February 2nd. It's Imbolc. It's a festival of lights, of inspiration. It's sacred to the triple goddess, Brigid, from whom we get the Catholic saint, Saint Bridget. One of the aspects of Brigid is that of creative inspiration. Another is the crucible, the forger's fire. I'll tell you this, I certainly felt like I was in the crucible during that visit with my peers, that review of my visit with the patient. I felt the way Jesus must have felt on the road, with everyone watching him, when he realized what he was doing, how he was passing by that suffering, how he could rebuke the scribes and the elders for failing to respond with kindness in the name of the law of rules, and how he was carrying on his agenda without seeing her suffering. We have a very human Jesus in this story. On his way, focused, ignoring that which interrupts him, inspires. But what Jesus does sets an example for all of us. He embraces the burning inspiration, the crucible fire, the fire that transforms, shapes, and burns us into new shapes. And he uplifts the woman he just called a dog. He swallows his pride, and he uplifts the woman he called a dog. He welcomes the stranger, the other, this Canaanite, the woman from the people his tribes have fought for generations. And he praises her, how great is your faith. And then he eases her suffering. Her daughter is healed. What an incredible example for us. I remember other times in the hospital where I did follow that inspiration, that call. A woman crying in the emergency room area, and when I stopped and helped her find her way, and she found her family before they were moved to another facility. A man standing in a hallway looking lost. I stopped and found out he was a World War II veteran, waiting for his wife. And I learned that nobody in his family wanted to hear his stories anymore. So I heard 2 of his stories about his life in the war before his wife caught up, and he left with a huge smile on his face. Visits where I followed someone off the beaten path into unusual, creative conversations, and where their stories were heard and there was healing. There are many moments for me where that creative inspiration did draw my attention, and what follows are amazing moments, at times even miraculous moments. So you know what happens after this story in Matthew? Jesus goes into what is about a frenzy of healing. He heals multitudes and amazes crowds. He feeds thousands. His miracles go on overdrive. And shortly thereafter, he has this famous conversation with Peter where he's named the Messiah. After a woman interrupts him on his way and he embraces her suffering. Moment of inspiration, sacred to Brigide this time of year. That inspiration that calls us to deeper grace. So now we come to one of my favorite reflections about this story. So Brigide is famous for bringing healing, inspiration, and the change of the forger's fire. So maybe it's a little heretical of me to imagine that Jesus was interrupted on the road by the inspiration of a Celtic goddess. And then as a result, she brought healing, transformation, and the grace of that God that I envision. The call to goodness and loving kindness for strangers, the Canaanites. I love that it was the cry of a woman that seems to have brought that change. I don't know. But the idea sure does tickle me. The idea of the creative feminine inspiring Jesus. When we encounter something that interrupts our agenda, our plan, and we listen to that fire of inspiration, like Jesus did on the road, where he praised an outsider and actually set her above his own people. And it's after healing her suffering that he comes into his full power. So when we stop and listen to that call, miraculous things can happen. So seminary has made deeper my relationship with this faith, my relationship with creation, the sacred, and it's also clarified my agenda. Sometimes, like Jesus, I respond to the cry of the stranger, I am here for the Unitarian Universalists. Sometimes in a hospital room, I catch myself wanting to preach, to follow that road, to preach justice, equity. It's not an accident that it was a Gentile woman who helped Jesus see that God's grace is for all. Are not the dogs to be saved as well? If I'm paying attention with loving kindness, then when I walk into a room with a patient and see a family of someone who's dying, I forget the mission that sent me to seminary. To preach into the world religious liberty and the freedom to follow your heart and soul, the way the sacred speaks to each of us. I forget that I'm in the room of people who are different than me, who may have been involved in putting in place legislation that bothers me. If I'm lucky, I forget my agenda and my identity. The identity that puts me with what I consider to be my chosen ones, my people of Israel, you folks here. And all I hear is the suffering. My daughter is tormented by a demon. And if I listen to that call, that voice of the stranger, then I can respond with loving kindness. When I do that, I have been embraced. I have seen joy, relief, I've seen healing. If I forget what I am on about and listen to the interruption, the stranger, the inspiration, the thing is, every one of us has that power. We are strong voices for change in this denomination. We are not afraid to challenge the scribes, the elders, the Pharisees of the world, the people sitting on Capitol Hills. When we speak to the world, it is with the prophetic voice of justice, equity, and compassion. Let us also embrace our power to be interrupted, inspired, changed, burned in that Smith's crucible, struck by the voice of a goddess. The power to answer the cry of a stranger on the road, to respond with loving kindness, healing, grace, instead of staying our course. then let's see what joy and grace comes to pass in the world around us, what miracles are invited into creation. Please rise now in body or in spirit to join us for our closing hymn, Amazing Grace.